What's up, everyone? Welcome. We are live right now in the CannaBuzz community, and you're watching us right now on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a great episode today for you. We have our guest, Brandon Rust from Bokashi Earthworks. I'm sure you've seen him all over the place. You've seen him on different YouTube channels or on Instagram. He's always dropping some great knowledge. So I'm super stoked to have him today. But before we get too into it, I have a few shout outs that I need to make. First, like I just said at the top, shout out to our friends in the CannaBuzz community. We've got a few folks in the chat just hanging out with us. And then at the end of every live stream, when we do these interviews, we like to give away a pack of seeds or something like that to our friends in the live chat. So join our community, search CannaBuzz in the App Store, or go to cannabuzz.app in your browser and use the code GROWERSLOVE at checkout for 50% off your first month. Your support helps us make this show possible, helps us send out cool gear to all of our community members, all that kind of stuff. So join us over there. We'd love to see you in our community and in our app. Also, shout out to our friends TikiMadMan over at TikiMadMan.com and TikiSeeds.com. He's always hitting us up with the latest deals. What's the latest from him, JR?
Today, I want to talk a couple things coming from Tiki. He has a breeding project that he did for all of us here in the CannaBuzz family. We're really excited about that. We're going to be making announcements about that soon. Also, he did a collab with Sunken Treasure Seeds. And there's a list of 4 or 5 really good ones you can see at NeptuneSeedBank.com. Just go check out Neptune. And he's got all the Tiki offerings, and you can see the latest that he's done with Sunken Treasure Seed collab.
Awesome. And we're also going to give shout outs to our friends at Grove Bags and Lost Coast Plant Therapy. We'll get those shout outs in later in the show. But let's get into this great interview that we have for you today with our guest, Brandon Rust. Today we have Brandon Rust from Bokashi Earthworks. He's originally from SoCal, but currently resides in Oklahoma. He's got a vast knowledge of plant nutrition and a bunch of amazing products that we're going to be talking about today. Some really cool stuff. You can watch it on Instagram. It's been really cool to watch him over the months, or probably a year now. I imagine him doing the different NutriPots and different iterations. We're going to be getting all into that. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Brandon Rust.
Yes, thanks for having me. For any of your listeners who aren't familiar with me, my name is Brandon Rust. I have been cultivating cannabis for a little over 22 years. I work in the conventional, legal market as an agronomist, and I have a consulting company, and I also own Bokashi Earthworks, which is a company. We manufacture soil, we manufacture microbes, and we sell Humic fertilizer from NASA Agricultural Technologies.
Very cool.
Yeah, thanks. Welcome to the show. Today we want to really kind of go over some of the nutrient talk. A lot of people see NPK, and then they get recipes that come with lines, and then maybe sometimes they want to deviate a little bit and try this and that. And so they can get confusing for people what things do and how they are applied. And so I thought today it would be great to go over some of that. You do have a great Instagram presence where you break down a lot of this knowledge for people who want to go down that rabbit hole. Definitely check out Brandon's Instagram channel or account. It's got a lot of good stuff. But at first, we always like to start our interviews by asking you, how did you fall in love with the plant and start your journey?
I started smoking when I was, I don't know, 14, 15 years old, something like that. I think it was like it was like summer of 8th grade when I was going to be going into, before I went into 9th grade.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah, for some reason that year.
That's a weird year.
Or that summer, yeah.
Summer that changes everything. I was actually on medication for like ADHD and crap like that, and I was
Mm-hmm.
on some terrible medicine. It just made me feel terrible. And when I was probably like 14, I started smoking weed, and I just like, stopped taking all of that stuff, and I kind of just fell in love with it. It was one of those things that changed my perception of reality, and it was really kind of a psychedelic experience. Not the first couple of times I didn't get high, but I don't remember when it was, but I would probably say a couple of times after I had been smoking, a couple of times, and really, I was like hallucinating. I was tripping. I was
Yeah.
tripping when I was a kid and I smoked, dude. I was like, but it made me see a different perspective of things. So that kind of started changing me, as a person. And plus, obviously that being that age, your ideas and perceptions and what you want to do and everything are kind of
You're
starting to
also
change. So,
choosing paths, you know what I mean? That's a very volatile age, and some people might click in a path that maybe might take them down a different direction that they may not find desirable.
oh yeah, and I've been there too. I was
Yeah. Cheers
I
to
was
that.
homeless. I was homeless as when I was like from the time I was like 15, 16, when I was 15, 16, 17, I was like getting kicked out of my house all the time with the foster lady that I lived with. And by the time I was 17, I already had a job. I graduated um at an apartment with a friend of mine. So I was pretty independent pretty early. I've always worked and stuff like that. I started working when I was 12. And even before that, I would do stuff like I'd go around the block selling fruit off of like I remember the first time I ever had moved into a house because we moved a lot when I was younger. But she'd get more kids and stuff, and so she expanded her foster operation. But I remember this one house had some grapefruits, I think lemons and oranges. And I used to go around the block filling up the radio flyer. I'd fill it up with those fruits, and I'd go door to door, knocking on people's door, trying to sell them.
That's incredible. That's
So
awesome.
you
Yeah,
have you have such an amazing amount of knowledge, or I always see these like clips from talks that you've given on different YouTube channels, or your own channel. And you're just dropping knowledge bombs. Where do you think when you were growing up, when you were in school or whatever, do you see now, kind of looking back, those elements of yourself where you like kind of glommed onto different details like that? Because it's such an interesting, your brain just like soaks up these little different details, and you're able to share that information. Not everyone can do that, because I could like kind of general overall like kind of get the gist of it, but to be able to say all these details is just, it's fascinating to me.
well, so school for me was kind of like traumatizing, honestly.
Yeah.
Uh, I I had a lot of trouble in school, and I was actually like put in special ed when I was very young. Again, I was on medication as well at that time. I actually, I think I went to a completely different school, like a special ed school when I was in fourth grade, and then I went back to a regular school at some point. But it was like I moved so much, and I was like, it wasn't until eighth grade when they did a bunch of testing, and they're like, because I didn't do well. Like I didn't do well in school. Like I didn't do well in middle school. I got C's and D's. I just couldn't fucking pay attention. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I the only thing that kept my attention was there was when I was in middle school there was a science technology math program, and it was different classrooms, but it was like all integrated. So some of the projects they would be integrated between three different teachers and three different classrooms, and it would be science. You do like math where you do some engineering, and some science where you'd like, hey, this is how you engineer these things, and then you do the technology side where you go and build like a balsa wood bridge, and you incorporate all of the
That's
Oh, that's
different.
cool.
tight. Yeah, that is cool.
So that type of stuff, I love that, and I did really well. But for the most part, I was a pretty bad student all around. I just didn't give a shit, dude. I couldn't care less. That was the whole problem. Same thing in high school. High school, I thought was a fucking complete joke. As soon as I got there, I was like, "You got to be fucking shitting me." I was
Yeah,
like, "You
well,
got."
we've talked about on the show about how we feel it's just a giant daycare so that parents could be economic slaves, but we won't get all into that.
I mean,
So,
look.
how did you get the entrepreneurial spirit to start Bokashi Earthworks, and when did that all go down?
Well, so I started, I was smoking weed, and obviously, as a poor kid, you can't fucking just like smoke weed whenever you want because it's fucking,
Yeah,
you gotta fucking pay for that shit. Your homies
right,
are only willing to smoke so many bowls with you before you become the fucking mooch. You know what I mean?
right.
So, I did what any fucking smart kid would do. He fucking bought a little bit more than he needed and fucking sold half and smoked half. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So I was just like buying little bags of weed to pay for my own habit, essentially. But I always had a job too. So I'd work. When I was younger, I was working at like fast food. I worked at Humane Society, bowling alley. I worked at a bunch of different places. But I was not going. I was a punk rocker too, so I was so anti government and like just anti-system. It was really system, and it wasn't so much. Now I realize that being anti-government is kind of like being anti-people because it's we the people that create these things, and it's just like if we're not collectively holding other people accountable, then the whole thing doesn't work, which is why everything's gotten out of control because nobody collectively holds each other accountable. But
Yeah.
that's a different topic. um I just didn't want to fucking do that. I saw what working was. I saw the whole system as a whole. I saw all these things, and I was like, I'm not going to do it, and that's why I trapped for 18 years. The only
Well,
problem with that is I also did 2 prison terms. You know what I mean?
yeah,
So I
Yeah.
got
yeah.
fucking tired of going to prison, and I got out of prison. I mean, I started going to jail when I was 18 years old. You know what I mean? And I was in and out of jail and prison all the way until I was about 35 or 36, 35. Right? I think I fucking spent, goddamn, I don't know how many birthdays and fucking locked up. And I just got tired of it, dude. And it wasn't because I was committing crime. It was because, like, there's no, like, in my opinion, I was like, there's no crime because crime, like, the definition of crime means there's a victim. And there's supposed to be something called habeas corpus, which is to, present a body. So if there's somebody that is accusing me of a crime, they should be able to say, hey, this person wronged me in some way. But that's just not the case. And so, in common law, I think that would be the case, but we don't operate under common law, from my understanding, anymore. But I just was so against the system. I was like, no, I'm just gonna do what I do, and I love fucking weed. So I just kept doing the thing, and I got, in 2006, I got popped with like 256 plants on my indoor spot, and let's see, I got fucking popped for a bunch of shit, but ended up taking
Well,
it.
can I stop you for a sec, Brandon? At the
Yeah,
end of the day, can you tell people why? What eventually led them to your door on 256 plants?
a woman.
Lesson to be learned, guys. And I've got and gals. I am going to say, be careful with your mate because many times we've had situations where people will just get into a relationship and that ends up being the mouth that goes south, and then you have trouble. So, if you operate, be careful out there. Sorry to interrupt.
Nope, you're all good. So yeah, I I did it. I was cultivating, back in like early 2002. I think is when I started working with the older homeboys, some of my dad's friends. My dad's been in prison for almost 28 years now. He got busted in 96.
For the plant,
No, he a bunch of other stuff. I'm not going to get into it, but
that's
he
fine. That's
got a
fine.
57 to life. He got a 57 to life, but he's been in there for almost 30 years. Um, but essentially, I just was like, dude, I got to figure out a way because I was like, I don't want to stop doing this. I was like, I don't really, at this point, I don't really know what else to do, and it's like, I don't want to
Yeah.
do fucking construction. I don't want to do drywall or electric or fucking pump concrete or fucking do finished carpentry. I don't want to fucking do flooring. You know what I mean? I don't want to fucking do any of that shit. Like, I don't want to bust my ass and like beat my fucking body up day in and day out because I know there's other ways that I could use my brain to so that was the thing because I've done all these jobs but I've never had a job more than 6 months, right? So I have a bunch of skills and stuff. I learned a bunch of stuff from doing all these different types of trades, but at the end of the day, I've just mainly just grown wheat. I paid my bills fucking hustling, slanging weed, and fucking growing weed. And that's what I did for a really long time. I wanted to not keep going to prison. So when I had an opportunity to come out to Oklahoma, I came out here to work in the legal market. Working in the legal space has its own challenges.
Yes, it
Just
is.
because you're always fucking chasing your tail when it comes to legislation because none of these people are united enough to have a presence at the Capitol where the legislation is being written to keep these fucking idiots from doing asinine things that negatively impact small businesses and have a negative
Right.
impact on the economy, all in the name of fucking tax, regulation, and control. They think that by some sort of like miracle, them fucking overregulating and taxation is going to make the problems that are essentially created because of taxation and regulation are going to disappear. And because they
Yeah,
have a
but
huge
I think that's systematic leveraging and trying to push individuals out and make it a lot more pay to play. We've seen that same recipe in every state. I'm in Oregon, Sam's in Cali,
yep.
and Washington's right above us, and we see how that all plays out. These lobbyists and attorneys come in with their crews, and they come in and they start systematically weeding the market out. So Oklahoma resisted rec this last round. Can you talk? Maybe go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it was a shit bill. It was a bill written by and sponsored by Metric, not written by them, but it was affiliated with them through the legislation and their lobbyists. And the only thing that I want to see is I want to see the old medical program that we had that wasn't all fucked up. I want to see that go into the state's constitution and have adult use written the state's constitution. That way it's protected from the
Yeah.
lobbyists and all the people.
People don't understand that either. Because if you
Yeah.
don't write it into your legislation, what they do is they come in with their little SBs and they'll shift
Their
it
bill.
this way
Yeah.
and they'll shift it that
Yeah.
way. And the next thing you know, it's so perverted from what the people voted on that it's not even nearly the same.
Yeah. So it takes a whole different, entirely different process to get it as a constitutional amendment on the state's constitution. But once that does pass, it's voted, it has to be like majority vote, and all these different things have to happen. But once that does happen, every year when the House goes into session and they change taxes and legislation for business and this, cannabis always has a target on its back. And so they
Yeah.
always take a shotgun approach where they're like, do this. And some of those things end up passing. And after several years of little small changes, the whole
Yes.
program looks different. It's been pieced
Yep.
apart. And then everybody like in California, dude, California shit the bed, dude. I mean, I think like I heard something like 80% of farms didn't renew their licenses. And it's
Yeah.
like, well, how many of those people are just fucking going back to the traditional market and not worried about paying taxes anymore?
Right.
But
Right.
like I said,
Crazy. And so now you got into Oklahoma. And so is that when Bokashi Earthworks started?
no, I was doing that actually before. So the company actually started in around 2015, but not really officially on paper. So I started in growing organics, and we were using Alan Atkinson's Grow Kashi product, and I was in the Probiotic Farmers Alliance on Facebook back then. And because I switched over from growing in soil with nutrients to organics, and before I was doing soil with nutrients, I was doing all hydroponics for like 11 years. I did that, and then so I was switching everything out because the prices of fucking weed started to drop and shit. So I needed to figure out how to cut my costs, and I was like running like house and garden. I was running like 11 different fucking things, and I was like, what is all this shit? I started reading the fucking labels.
Right.
I started reading the labels and figuring out like, holy shit, like this says this is derived from Leonardinite, or this is derived from Langbonite. There was a product I remember, can't remember what it was. It was a PK booster. They were marketing it as a PK booster, and it was Langbonite, right? And Langbonite costs about $24 for a 50-pound bag. But they were selling these liters. They were selling these liters that were like 98% water with a little bit of Langbonite in there for like $100 a bottle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I was like, what the fuck? I started reading all that. That's how I actually started switching up. I got into organics because a lot of the stuff that companies use, and even like companies that do salts, they'll still use natural, like things like magnesium sulfate, potassium sulfate. Those things are like natural mineral elements, So I just got to the point where I started using raw ingredients, and I had to figure out how to use raw ingredients as opposed to like an NPK percentage, which is all those NPK percentages are kind of wrong anyway, and they don't really understand. I don't think most people or most companies have a real clear, concise understanding of the nutritional requirements for that particular plant as far as like the nutrient requirements,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that actually takes us into our next segment. It's a great segue, actually, which
Yeah,
we are going to
great.
talk about nutrition, or plant nutrition, or plant nutrients in particular. So, let's walk through the different kind of NPKs to start with, and then we'll get into the others. But let's start with nitrogen. What's the role of nitrogen in cannabis's plant growth cycle?
Well, not let's not be exclusive to cannabis, but all plants. And not just plants, but also a whole lot of groups of bacteria, yeast, and fungi as well. Nitrogen plays a crucial role in DNA production, RNA and DNA production. So any type of protein contains nitrogen grouping in it. So nitrogen is needed for amino acid synthesis and also protein production. So that's one of the main things. There's a lot of other things as well. Another main thing is chlorophyll. So the center of every chlorophyll molecule is going to be magnesium, and then it has a grouping of a ring of nitrogen molecules. And so chlorophyll is responsible for, that's the pigment that catches photosynthetic light and needed for photosynthesis.
What's up, everyone? Just jumping in real quick to give a couple shout outs to our sponsors. First, shout out to Neptune Seed Bank. If you need some seeds, make sure to go to neptuneseedbank.com. They've got tons of great breeders. They're the biggest bank in the US, is what they say, and they've got all sorts of great genetics there. So be sure to go to neptuneseedbank.com. Thanks to them for supporting the show. And also, huge shout out to our big sponsor this year, Lost Coast Plant Therapy. This stuff is great if you need to knock down bugs or botrytis or powdery mildew or anything like that. Make sure to check out Lost Coast Plant Therapy. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it at your local grocery store. You can find it all over the place, but make sure to support them. It's all organic. You don't have to worry about residues. You can even spray it. I've used it this year to help me fight powdery mildew and bud rot on my outdoor. I sprayed it while I was harvesting. That's how much I trusted this stuff. We also have a great interview with Dirk, the co-founder of the company. Check that out on our channel. So a huge shout out to Lost Coast Plant Therapy. Thank you for supporting the show, and thank you for supporting our sponsors. And let's go back to the interview.
And so based on a veg transition bloom. Can you talk about where you want your nitrogen applications to be and maybe where you don't?
Yeah, so typically if you're looking at any type of crop production across agriculture, in conventional agriculture, they'll typically use diammonium or monoammonium phosphate depending on which crop. The monoammonium has less nitrogen in it than the diammonium, which has I think twice as much. And the reason why they do that is because at the beginning, the plants they require a large amount of phosphorus. Phosphorus will help with stimulate root growth, and phosphorus is also responsible for ATP, adenine triphosphate, which is energy exchange currency. So you can think of the phosphate molecule as so highly reactive that it can be used in different types of metabolic processes because it forms this this chemical, ATP. It forms this chemical that essentially is used for energy production across all different types of plant metabolisms.
And so as you're fading through in your transitional period, that's when your nitrogen is fading out, but it
No,
still
not so
needs to
much.
be present at
So
some degree, correct?
what you would want to see is, so for real small plants, seedlings, you want to see nitrogen, but you kind of want to see more. You will also want to see an abundance of phosphorus. Now, nitrogen is kind of a weird element in the fact that you can't just you like we could do a whole episode just on nitrogen. I could talk. It would it's very very complex because we have nitrogen cycling, we have we have mobilization and immobilization, and
Yeah.
then we have denitrification. We have amox bacteria that they use ammonium and they convert it into nitrous oxide, and there's just all these different types of reactions that are happening constantly with nitrogen. But essentially, for the plant requirement of nitrogen, it depends on your veg cycle, right? You're going to need a larger quantity of nitrogen if you're going to veg longer, or if you have a lot more biomass, right? So if you were going to look at nitrogen, it would almost kind of be a logarithmic scale upwards that goes along with the growth of the plant. So as the biomass of that plant grows, the nitrogen usage would also need to increase because every single part of that plant is potentially has some type of photosynthesis process, any green part of that plant. And so it's going to need more nitrogen for that and to keep building proteins, right? Proteins are responsible for building cells and building the actual dimensions, like the actual plant material, the biomass itself. It's going to be, carbon and cellulose and all those things. So you're going to need that nitrogen to build that up. And so as the plant gets larger, the plant needs more nitrogen, right? As you transition, it's kind of like a flat curve, and then you kind of decrease and you want to go down at the end, right? So you don't want to totally cut off nitrogen. And we do some kind of strange things in cannabis that aren't really done in commercial production. And I guess not really strange. It's actually, it's how we achieve better yields and stuff. And that's like bottom pruning, right? And so eliminating parts of the plant that are receiving less energy, that might be consuming more energy than they're outputting, because the whole part of the plant, the whole idea of like photosynthesis and what it's doing, is it's the only system in nature that brings an outside energy source and brings it into our domain. It's taking outside energy from the sun and is converting it into like physical biomass. You know what I mean? That's full of like minerals, nutrition, carbon. It's
Right.
making dimensional
It's like a 3D printer.
It is. It really
The-
is, and I could go real deep into that on another episode on because it's really crazy. It is
yeah,
kind of like
yeah.
Yeah, and
factor
again,
that.
we'll recommend people go check out your Instagram and all your presences out there on YouTube because there's some really good information and you can go as deep down the rabbit hole as you want with Brandon. And so now with nitrogen, what is a real kind of gentle way to apply it in the way that you know you're not going to give it too much of a burn? And then maybe talk about the burn a little bit.
Yeah, so if you're burning your plants, you're obviously giving them too much, but it also depends on which type of nitrogen that you're giving them because there's essentially three main types of nitrogen. Some people will only say two, but most agronomists will tell you nitrate and ammonical nitrogen, like something like urea or diammonium phosphate is another one. And then you have things like calcium nitrate or potassium nitrate. There's a bunch of different types of ag chemicals. And then there's things like blood meal, which is organic. You'll get some solubility. Feather meal, alfalfa meal. All those have a lot lower percentage of nitrogen, and they take a total of about 3 weeks to be completely solubilized in the soil, depending on the conditions of the soil.
And if I'm
And
using oh, sorry. If I'm using manures, are there some that are more gentle manures than others that are more hot?
well, so when it comes to manures, those are kind of tricky because it depends on what the animal was eating and if, what the nutrition of that particular plant looked like. So if that particular plant had a high nitrogen content, then you're probably going to have a higher nitrogen content in the manure. But you also might get a lot of other stuff in there as well. And typically when I'm looking, at like soil tests, I'm looking for balance and I don't do I might add manure as a amendment to like soils, like outdoor soils, but typically peat based or cocoa already have enough organic matter that's not required. And there's other ways that I like to adjust the mineral nutrition than using compost because compost can be so tricky because there's so much different things in there. They could be high in chloride, they might have too much potassium in it, right? And it's like, oh, okay, well, I just need a high nitrogen amendment. Well, this has also potassium, and oh, it might actually come with too much sodium in it as well. It might have so there could be different things that you may not want in that system, and so that's kind of the importance of testing. But I use a compost, not a manure compost, but a coffee based compost, coffee and chaff for like my soil mixes, and that's basically to add carbon, and that's one of the benefits of adding compost. You do get the nutrition. So if you were totally deficient, your soil was didn't have any nutrition, and obviously compost will work because you're getting a net benefit, right? Because if it's just totally deficient all across the board, when you're
Like
adding
a
compost
charge
into that
pack.
system, you're going to see a
Yeah.
net benefit because you're bringing something in there. But as far as like trying to balance something out with just compost, it's kind of a side note. I'm usually looking at single mineral inputs. Like if I'm addressing nitrogen, I might look at blood meal, feather meal, amino acid, soybean meal. Those are kind of like go-tos that I like to use that are organic or natural and have a higher percentage of nitrogen than something like insect frass or kelp meal or alfalfa, which I'm not saying those are bad. I'm just saying that the percentage is usually pretty low, which means the amount that you have to put into that system to bring that system up to sufficiency is far greater, which means it's going to increase your cost.
That makes sense.
A lot
Well,
of sense.
well, let's get into phosphorus next. Let's talk about phosphorus.
Yep. So if you're looking at an NPK, remember everybody, that is the total percentage of by volume of what is in that either a bottle if it's a solution or in the media if it's an amendment. And phosphorus is another one of those things. Phosphorus, we need that we need that consistently. So early, we need phosphorus and we need to kind of boost it just so we can help with that root growth. And, when you add phosphorus, that root growth, it helps with things like root inception. So any of the elements that are going to be picked up through inception, like copper and a few others, will have a net benefit because the roots will be able to sequester those elements. But phosphorus is really tricky because it's highly reactive in the plant available form, which is P2O5, which is the phosphate anion. It has to be either delivered in an ionic form through, like if you were using a nutrient like a synthetic fertilizer. Typically, synthetic fertilizer bases are diammonium or monoammonium phosphate, but sometimes there'll be something else with potassium phosphate. In organic settings, you might see something like high phos seabird guano. You might see something like bone meal. You might see something like rock phosphorus or calcium phosphate. There are other meals too that contain phosphorus, like crustacean crab meal, stuff like that, but it also contains other elements as well. And I typically look for whatever has the highest amount of phosphorus because I want to try to apply as little as possible. But we're also looking at
Yeah,
price.
so talk about that. Talk about kind of like the low and slow approach versus with consistency versus hammer, hammer, hammer.
Well, here's the thing. So it's really complicated when I think about all the different nuances that are happening both from a chemical and biochemical process if we're talking about soil and also hydroponics, because there's two different things that are happening, and some of them are happening in soil, some of them are happening also in a hydroponic system. So any type of salt, I think that one of the things that's really important to stress is salts, right? Because I think that they get a bad reputation because people often don't understand what they are. A salt is essentially a cation or a positively charged molecule attached to an anion, a negatively charged molecule. And I'll give you an example of this. A synthetically created fertilizer, diammonium phosphate, okay, it has ammonium, which has a positive charge, and phosphate, which has a negative charge. Now, when you add those two together, they will bond and they will form a solid or a salt. Now, in the case of something like that's natural, that is also considered a salt, right? These are something that's natural. They don't need to be processed. Let's take Epsom salt or gypsum. Let's take gypsum because that's so commonly used across agriculture. It is calcium sulfate. Both of those are plant elements. They're both needed. They're both secondary elements that are needed in pretty large quantities for the majority of plants. And it's calcium, which is a positively charged molecule attached to sulfate, which is the negatively charged molecule. Now, any of these types of salts, whether they're natural, whether they're created, when you put them in water, both of those anions, they are liberated from each other into that solution. Okay, and the water holds them, right? They hold them because the water also contains hydrogen, right? And they basically, the hydrogen is like going back and forth with these molecules in the water to the water, holding it in the water. Essentially, that's kind of my understanding of it.
And I also heard that light salt applications can actually boost fungal dominancy in your rhizosphere as well.
So it's not so much about the salts that are the issue, right? Because you can take different types of salts, whether natural or chemical, and they work, right? And they have pretty similar results. So the issue is that once you take that solution and then you put it into the ground or to your media, or in the case of hydroponics, you start mixing other things with it. You start mixing ammonium, diammonium sulfate, and then you add in something like calcium nitrate or calcium chloride. You're going to end up bonding your phosphorus to your calcium, right? And it precipitates out a solution. That's why people in hydroponics in these large facilities, they have all these different tanks that do different batch tank mix, because as soon as those things go together in solution, they start reacting because those things are so highly reactive. That's the physical nature of these elements, these molecules. And so what happens is in a setting in soil, you lose efficiency from the salt because they're so highly reactive that they'll end up bond, like, in a, let's take phosphorus again, in a pH system that's over, 6.3 or so, you're going to start bonding magnesium and calcium with phosphorus, and then you're not going to have either of those things be available. And a lower pH, you're going to start bonding phosphorus like things like aluminum, zinc, iron, manganese, because all of the ones that I mentioned after phosphate are all positively charged, and that phosphate has a negative charge, and it's so highly reactive, it'll just start tying things up. And then also things like phosphate, they leach out into waterways because the majority of the clay colloids have a negative charge, so they don't stick to each other because they're both negative. So the phosphate runs off with the water.
And we all know the implications of that, and we're seeing it in many of our living systems here on Earth. The next one we wanted to talk about a little bit is
Wait, I got one
potassium.
more thing to say though, because but phosphorus isn't needed in a massive quantity, right? It's a highly in a soil system. Phosphorus is highly mediated by biochemical weathering. So the release of secondary metabolites from bacteria, yeast, and fungi, enzymes that solubilize the parent appetite material that contain phosphorus and liberate the phosphate anion. That biological process needs to continually be happening to keep solubilizing and cycling that process. In the case that phosphorus does tie up with calcium, those bonds can be breaking through those microbial mediated processes, and also some environmental weathering processes do that as well. And there's certain conditions that those things are expedited, like, the right soil hydrology, the right type of soil structure, the right type of soil temperatures. They can all expedite that release of phosphate material. And the thing is, that process, you don't need a massive amount. You just need a consistent amount. So it would be kind of like a straight line through the whole plant. It might be a little bit, as biomass goes up, it needs maybe a little bit more energy, but it's not like nitrogen or calcium or potassium that needs 150 ppm or 125 ppm or 200 ppm. You're talking about 5 ppm, and I've seen it go under 1 ppm and still be sufficient, as long as that microbially mediated processes and those environmentally mediated processes keep cycling that phosphorus. Even if it ties things up, as soon as it's liberated in soil, sometimes it'll tie some stuff up. If it's in the rhizosphere, it'll diffuse across the root zone. But those processes are always constantly happening in real time.
Well, I think that's for me. I'm kind of a lazy grower, and I think that adding the amount of microbial interactions with a little bit of salt is what's allowed me to be successful without breaking the bank, and also without putting in a lot of effort. You know what I mean?
Well, if you want to increase the use efficiency for any type of salts, whether they're um, man-made or whether they're natural, like a mineral sulfate, is if you can get a hold of real humic and fulvic acids, like not leonardinite or like mineralized organic matter that has humic and fulvic acid in it, but actual like humic and fulvic acid, like extracts. Those will increase the use efficiency because they'll help carbon chelate some of those elements, and it'll also stimulate the microbiome at the same time that those are going in. So you'll get kind of a dual purpose effect that can
I'm
be.
glad. I'm glad you said that, because we're going to cover that in a segment, and I think humic and fulvics is also something people hear about but don't really understand their role, or maybe how to apply them, or what that situation. So moving into our last of the big NPKs is our potassium. Can you talk about its role in maybe flowering and the role of the plant as a whole?
Yep. So potassium is very important because it's a monovalent, it means it has a single charge. That's the available form. If you look at some of the other major soil cations, we're looking at calcium and magnesium. Those are divalent. They have two charges. And since it has a monovalent charge, it works with the sodium in the sodium ion pump, where it helps regulate the uptake of some other elements and from the soil. And then also potassium regulates the guard cells, the stomatal opening on the guard cells of the stomata, which essentially regulates transpiration. Right. So potassium is extremely important for transpiration. It's also important for a bunch of activation of a bunch of different enzymes and stuff like that.
I know it's kind of a rabbit hole. Can you tell people a little bit about transpiration and when it's happening and what's happening at that time?
Sure. So that's one of the reasons why we are always trying to keep our environments kind of dialed in perfectly, is because we want to optimize the amount of time that the plant is spending moving water through its system. And the way that it does that is, although we think of water as fluid, when we're talking about the way that these things work internally, we have to think of it in a different form. We have to kind of think of it as vapor, right? Like water vapor, or as a gas, because we're talking about molecular water, and we're also talking about molecular ions, nutrients, right? These things are incredibly, incredibly, vastly small. We're almost talking about like a different dimensional, like space entirely, that we get to kind of glimpse into when we're looking through electron scanning microscopes and stuff. But essentially, sorry, I got off topic. What was
We were
what was
talking
I?
about potassium, right?
Transpiration.
Oh, and
Yes,
transpiration.
transpiration.
Yeah.
So it's really important, because when we're talking about one of the ways that plants move nutrients through its system is through mass flow. And so anything that has kind of fallen into solution, it can, if it has the ability to be, you know, taken across the cells of the root, it moves with that water, and especially things like calcium, right? So that's why VPD is really important for calcium uptake, because it moves with water. And what you're trying to do is maximize the time spent that the plant is moving that water vapor through its thing. And you have like this pressure that's coming from the soil, right? And then you also have the evaporative transportation of that water vapor when the plant's stomata open up. So it's kind of forcing water through that transport system. And as long as the stomata are opening, it's able to release that vapor, and water vapor is able to move. And so you're moving nutrients through that plant. And so it aids in that process, which is very, very important. So if you don't have ideal conditions, or let's say, your potassium is really low, it starts shutting that system down, and then overall you start getting less water and less nutrients into that plant.
So let's talk about calcium, because you just talked about it there, and we're going to get into our secondary metabolites. And I'll just mention too, we're starting to run out of time on the show, so we still want to talk about humics and so much more. So we'll try to get through it, but let's go get into calcium. I'm super fascinated by its role in this whole process.
Yes, calcium is actually, I was surprised at the amount of calcium that is used. It is used in such large quantities that I would almost consider it a macronutrient for cannabis, even though it's considered a secondary nutrient.
I would agree
And
with that.
there's almost no, I mean, I have not seen a cap on how much calcium can be given. I've only seen, antagonisms that can happen by adding too much calcium into the soil, where it could tie up phosphorus, or it could push out potassium and magnesium, and you're not getting enough of that. but I've seen, a target, a leaf target tissue range 5.5 is like you're banging, dude. But I've seen, like when I went up to Northern California and looked at Mendo Dope Boys, their plants were pushing like 8.5% calcium, and they look beautiful, So I haven't seen a cap on the amount of calcium, but there's antagonisms that you can cause by giving it too much in nutrient solutions with other nutrients and in soil solutions. So you have to be careful how it's applied. Um, but it's one of those things that I always like to front load and get a lot of in veg. And then I use smaller amounts throughout the entire cycle. But I also kind of dip off, right during transition so I can kind of push potassium a little bit harder because I want potassium to help with that process that we just talked about, but also it'll help with the hardening and setting and bulking of flowers later on. And
Okay.
so if we get that into the system a little bit earlier so we can keep running the calcium throughout flower, I see a lot better results. I see a lot more resilience to pests and pathogens. And then what I'll do is I'll do kind of a little potassium boost, probably around week 3 of flower, and then I'll go back to my normal calcium, and then back at week like 5, 6, I'll add a little extra potassium again.
Interesting.
And
With
so what about,
oops,
oh,
sorry.
sorry, Q. So now all of us, we look at our watersheds and we have calcium present in our water. What of it's available, first of all? And if I do have low calcium in my water, like I'm a soft water place, how can I supplement with that? Is it just back to the CalMag and maybe talk a little bit about calcium and its need to be separated from mag in products like CalMag.
Okay, so
That was a lot.
let's just
Sorry,
touch on the
that
water. Okay,
was a
so the
lot.
water. Let's talk about the water first. So
Okay.
I always test water. I always test water with Logan Labs so I can see what's in it because calcium is a nutrient. So if you have calcium in your water, that could be a good thing. The thing is how much calcium. Because if you have 100 ppm of calcium and you're using that same water every time to water, then what's going to end up happening is over a period of time you're going to accentuate that. And if we're talking about something that like sodium instead of calcium, right? It's always best to know what's in your water. If you're doing that with sodium, you could be going through a couple runs, everything's good, and then all of a sudden you can't figure out why your soil isn't performing anymore because you've jacked up that sodium level over the time because you've been bringing it in through your water. So I always test water to see what's in it. And some water is clean. Some water just needs KDF filters. Some water needs specialized filters, like if you have too high of like copper levels, and then some can just use standard RO. It just depends on the water test itself. I always try to do whatever is least necessary to get the best result. And so, some places just have really bad water and they have to use RO. They have to have some type of filtration. It's kind of circumstantial, but there are target ranges that I provided, like on my Patreon, for instance. You can find cannabis leaf tissue targets. You can find water quality targets. Even on my Instagram, if you scroll down on my feed a couple posts, there's a picture of like an ocean, and if you look at that body of water, all that text is all water quality goals, and you can see how much is between what and what, how much calcium, how much magnesium, how much sodium, how much chloride, how much iron, how much of all of these elements is adequate or too much, and it's kind of in a chart so you can see what are the acceptable levels, and it's
And
something
I
to
think
take.
that's powerful information because a lot of people go into the grow shop not knowing that, and then they go in and look for this feeding schedule that's going to put them on a path that's going to give them, like you said, inavailabilities, too much availabilities, and all of that. And again, thanks so much, Brandon, for all your information. Now I want to slide into that humic and fulvics.
Yep.
Can you kind of just break them down? We were going to break it down separately, but just kind of give a synopsis of humics and fulvics and what
Yeah,
their role
definitely.
in.
So Bokashi Earthworks carries hands down the best humic fulvic acid fertilizer on the market. It's a completely carbon chelated formulation developed by my mentor, Dr. George. He was a NASA scientist. He helped develop the Apollo space shuttle, the space rocket. And he's developed this technology, and he has different factories located all over the world. And it's an interesting technology because he's not just taking mineralized organic matter like leonardinite or lignite and then crushing it up and then selling it here. This is humic and fulvic acid, because that's what mostly you see on the market. So if you get something and you get like a granulated humic or fulvic acid, and it says on the back derived from leonardinite, right? So what happens is, millions of years ago, we had huge dense canopies of organic matter. They all turned into this mineralized organic matter as they were in the soil, as they were over time. And so we end up with this like charcoaly type organic material. Has a lot of carbon, has a lot of oxygen, has hydrogen in it, has iron, manganese, zinc, has all the things that the plant had in it as well. And what you're able to do is, most people, the benefit of getting a material like that is because it does have different groupings in there, elemental groupings. And as it breaks down, it'll release some zinc, some iron, and some of this and this and this. And it does have a small percentage of humic and fulvic acid. But real humic and fulvic acids, they'll take that material, they'll micronize it down to a very fine mesh, 200 mesh. And then they'll fluidize it, and then they'll change the pH on it. They'll jack the pH up, make it very alkaline. And what happens is, both humic and fulvic acid are soluble at very high pH ranges. And so all of the junk that's in there will fall out, because there's a bunch of other stuff that's in there. And to get the most humic and fulvic acids, we're looking geologically at that starting material to have something around like 45 to 48% carbon, 25 to 28% oxygen, and about 3 to 4% hydrogen, because that's going to give you the most humic and fulvic acid groups. Because what these are carboxyl groupings, or they're carboxylic acids, which are these low weight molecular organic compounds that kind of group together and make these different chains. And they can grab onto mineral elements and hold them in carbon, in these little carbon lattices. Now, during this processes, when they're fluidized, all of this in an alkaline solution, all of the other junk just kind of falls out, and you'll collect all of the pure humic and fulvic, or the pure carboxylic acids, right? Now, the low weight organic molecules are in solution with the heavier organic molecules. So the humic acid is the heavier, the fulvic acid is the lighter.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
Okay, so now what happens? Check this out. What happens is that's fluidized. All the junk, all the rest of the stuff has fallen out. It's called humane, Humin. All this stuff has just fallen out. All these other different types of carbon, which you can use in soils and other stuff, but it's not for this purpose of extracting pure humic and fulvic acids. Then we drop the pH and we acidify it, because what happens is humic acids are not soluble in acidic conditions, and so they'll precipitate out of solution. So all of the heavyweight, or the heavier organic molecules, when the pH drops, they'll fall out of solution, and so you'll have fulvic acid separated out from humic acid. So you can take off the humic, you can take out off the fulvic acid, you can take out all the precipitated humic acid. So now you have pure fulvic and pure humic acid. You can use those now to like carbon chelate other elements. So if you were to add in micronutrient sulfates for iron, or if you were to add in manganese or zinc or phosphorus, even nitrogen under pressure, what you do is, if you fluidize those and then put them under pressure, super high pressure, you can chelate all of that stuff. That's how our fertilizers are made. But real humic and fulvic acids are that process that happens with the fluidized humic and acid. And then you have real humic and fulvic acids. A lot of other stuff on the shelf are just lignite or leonardinite ground up in a bottle or in a bag.
And so what are they? And so the main purpose is for them to make ionically available these micronutrients that the plant needs in order to do all of its functions in whatever stage it's doing.
Yeah, so we take it even further, and with the process, and we'll carbon chelate everything: the nitrogen, the potassium, the phosphorus. But if you were to just take that humic and fulvic acid now, right, that has a net benefit in things like agricultural soils because acts as a biostimulant. So it stimulates the biology, and that biology will actually produce like sidiaphores and other compounds that can solubilize ions and from the soil, the parent apatite material in soil, and can also create like sidiaphores that chelate those. And then the fulvic acid itself can actually chelate things that are in soil. So if you have mineral nutrition in soil, it can help it from reacting. So you're stimulating the biology, and then any time you bring in organic carbon into a system, it'll help with water retention as well. So it'll help with keeping more water in that system. So it has a net benefits, and it's multifunctional. But I
So
think people
and
have to
also
understand that there's different types.
so it's kind of like making sure the battery's charged and you got a good buffer for availability whenever exchanges need to be exchanged, kind of thing.
That's a good way to think about it, because it offers all of these positive and negative sites on these complex carbon chains for mineral elements to be diffused and translocated from the solution or from that carbon chain to the plant root, so or into solution that goes to the plant root. So it's amazing. And here's the thing: all of these things exist naturally in the soil in really small quantities, and so bringing up these quantities helps stimulate the biomes, and it has a massive impact overall plant health. You can decrease abiotic stresses, you can help with uptake of nutrients. It does a
And
lot
that
of
to
good.
me even goes for people who plant inside the earth or plant in some sort of container or pot
Yeah,
bed, whatever. You know what I
yeah.
mean? Yeah. So I mean, if
Have
especially
you
back in the day, as guerrilla growers, you maybe couldn't get to every single plant. And at the end of the season, when you maybe got to that plant that had just been kind of chilling out there all year by itself on its own, it has a completely different genetic expression than everything else that's been treated with the love and kindness of your advancements.
the cool thing about the humate fertilizer that we have at Bokashi Earthworks is that you can use it in conjunction with any other fertilizer line, with any other microbe product, and it will help increase the effectiveness of those products because it has the carbon that's available to the microbes if it's a microbial product, and it has an additional like 46 or 7% pure fulvic acid that'll help chelate any of the salts that you're using, or it'll help cycle the mineral amendments if you're doing organic for top dressing. So it's a multifunctional product that can be used in conjunction with a lot of the other things, and it'll allow you to decrease,
Yes.
the things
And
that you're
that's
using.
money saved, right? At the end of the
Yes.
day, the little bit of that addition is gonna save you at the end. You're gonna net positive. There
Yeah.
are just a couple little guys I wanted to talk about.
Yep.
Sulfur being one of them. If you could just real quick break down how important sulfur is in flowering and its role in the plant as well.
Well, sulfur is often contributed with the essential oil production and terpene production off, and also things like sulfides, thiols, those types of things that kind of give the garlicky, skunky type smells. And it's not just in cannabis, but if you were to look at something like lavender production, you will see that those crops are typically given more sulfur just because it does have a positive net impact. But sulfur has a lot of different things that it's responsible for, not just increasing terpene production. It is an anion, so it does help with charge balance because the majority of what the plant's taking up is cations. It's needed for a lot of different like protein synthesis. It's needed for, I think it's a photosynthetic nutrient in some capacity. I have to go through all my stuff, but there's a bunch of information on my feed too. It goes through every single element that plant utilizes and kind of outlines what the main functions of sulfur would be, what the main functions of magnesium, calcium, and then
Yeah.
what the forms of those are.
Shout out to that again. Shout out to that. Another thing I've been hearing about, or that I recently read about, is the volatile sulfur compounds in cannabis that are separate of terpenes
That's what
that
I
are
just mentioned. I said
responsible
the
for.
sulfides and the thiols.
Yeah, and they're giving us our skunks, our garlics, our onions. Do
Yep.
you know about any of the medical entourage type implications with those at all?
I haven't really seen any studies. I haven't come across any research that
It's
talks
pretty
a whole
new
lot
shit,
about.
huh?
I haven't seen too much, man. I mean, there might be some papers out there, but typically, typically I come across new stuff in the realm of whatever. I'll be searching for something. Let's say I'll be looking for an answer, or like say, hey, I wonder if I could do this, or I wonder how I would approach this, and I wonder if there's any science behind this. And so I'll go down, and I'll look at through a search engine and try to find research on different topics, and that's how I come up with a lot of what I do as far as like using biologicals at certain periods to elicit certain responses for like biocrop steering. And that's why I know so much about all of the carbon based inputs and organic inputs and biostimulants and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple more questions that we want to get to before we let you go. I threw in a question that I wanted to ask because it's a problem that I ran into with my outdoor just in the last few weeks, but I also noticed a lot of outdoor growers talking about it as well. I'm on some Facebook groups and Reddit groups and stuff like that, and that is botrytis or bud rot. Um, do you have a product? Because I know you have so many cool things that you offer. Do you have a product that helps prevent that, and how can growers fight that? I'm just curious if you have
Yeah.
tips, because I'm sure you have knowledge.
Yeah. So a lot of times botrytis gets really bad, and it's because of improper IPM management, and caterpillars can often be a start of that. So when you get some caterpillars that start burrowing through the weed, and then that weed starts to just completely mold out, that's one of the ways. If it's not caterpillars and it's just the variety is susceptible to environmental conditions that aren't optimal for where it's growing, that could be one. If you're in a really wet, humid climate and you're growing a variety that is really tight and compact and stocky, broadleaf, indica variety or something like that, you might want to rethink your cultivation strategy to find something that might be more equatorial, that has longer nodal spacing, maybe
We
thinner.
shout that out a lot. It's very important. I like that you said that. It's so important because a lot of people get wrapped up in the flavors and the strain of the day, and they think they can just throw that in their outdoor environment and be
No,
successful with
Right.
it.
that's not
And
how it works. Yeah,
not
no,
how it works
no.
at all.
But
That's why you see so much failure outdoors, because people are like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to grow this," but the whole thing is like, will this variety actually work in your location? With your climate conditions, because like
right,
And
here in
what
Oklahoma, it's super wet. It's been real wet this year. It's been really humid. And again, finding a cultivar that has longer nodal spacing, thinner leaves, that has better airflow, that's going to help. There's other things too. So I like to use things like Bouveria bassiana and Bacillus thuringiensis. Those are
that's what I was going to ask you
biocontrol.
about. Yeah, tell me about those.
Yeah, so those are something that we were selling on our website, but we're looking to get uh everything, like all of our labeling and stuff done, and it takes a shitload of money, like a lot of money.
Yeah, we've heard that before. So yeah,
So it's something that it's going to be a long process. But we have like the Bouveria, the Metatar Harzanium, and Asfolate is another. entomopathogenic fungus like Beauveria bassiana. It causes white muscadine disease and a lot of soft-bodied insects. It works on caterpillars. I like to also use the Bacillus thuringiensis. That's a bacteria that produces a metabolite that's toxic to caterpillars. And so I use a combination of both of those. And it's really important to do continual spraying throughout the entire season because they have different times of the year where they gestate, and then they have, they go through these different stages. And so you have to start early in the spring before, like before they start to hatch, when they're hatching, you have to be proactive about your IPM. And the same thing goes for like later on in the season. I also have a product called Kiaha, which is uses a natural surfactant, but if you use it at higher dosage rates, it works to as a pesticide for like aphids and whiteflies, stuff like that.
Okay.
But also for the botrytis and powdery mildew. So I love the combination. This is a consortium. And when I say consortium, it means that it is a combination that works synergistically together. And it is Bacillus subtilis and Trichoderma harzianum. And it is a bacteria and a fungus. And they both produce very similar metabolites, siderophores, antimicrobial compounds, and Trichoderma is very hungry for iron, and so it'll consume all the iron, and other microbes won't be able to have access to it, so they die. But
I want to go back, if I can. I'd like to go back to where you were talking about applications at stages, and if you could maybe mention a little bit mode of action versus like maybe ingestion versus attack from the outside, as you're kind of using those products throughout your cycle of IPM.
So I always use Microbe Plus, which is a consortium of 7 different microbes: purple non-sulfur bacteria, which is a photosynthetic bacteria, fermented fungi, and a bunch of bacillus species. But that's one of the things that I constantly use throughout the whole cycle. And I use that because it's multifunctional probiotic. It helps cycle nutrients, liberates phosphorus, helps with micronutrient uptake, and outcompetes pathogens in soil. So I don't have to worry about spore lading, molds, or other types of things that are going to harm my plant later on in flower. So that's one of the things that I just always use.
That's really interesting.
When we're talking
It
about
is really interesting because I read an article recently that powdery mildew has a life cycle in the soil. In the wet season, it spreads, and then in the dry season, it sporulates and gets out into the air. And so they were saying that the mulch layer protects and provides a home for the nematode that specifically will feed on that. And there's also, I think it's a bacillus bacteria that will also feed on the powdery mildew in the soil before it gets a chance to actually be on the leaf surface through the air.
Yeah, so they have a bunch of antimicrobial, antifungal compounds that they could produce. They can also produce enzymes, chitinases that'll kill those things off, and they'll break them down and use that as a carbon source for energy. There's all different types of stuff that could potentially be happening within the system. But if you're adding something like that, and I do it every 2 weeks, again, it's one of those things that can also help. Like if you have salts that's precipitated, it'll help break those salts back up too, making them available. So it's one of those things that's a multifunctional product that can be used with other products too. But I use that consistently. I use it once every 2 weeks. You use it on the same day. I just do that through my rotation. But also I have the IPM, we do that. I spray my plants every day. I go in there, I spray them with a little bit of Kiaha. I'm waiting on some, mineral oil and some micronized sulfur. And I'll just do that, frequently, at least once or twice a week. I'll be spraying for IPM with one of those products.
Yeah, and I think that's a good shout out, the micronized sulfur, because you can get that through wine wholesalers and through the wine industry very inexpensively. And so
Yeah,
micronized sulfurs,
it's even cheap on Amazon. You know what I mean? It's not
yeah,
something that's going to
Yeah.
break the bank. The thing is, if you try to use it in soil, it will decrease your soil pH. So be careful about the application and drenching it on your media. And also you never want to apply an oil after you've sprayed sulfur
good
because you
one,
will ruin your plants.
good
So
one.
that's one of the rules that is just like a one of the rules for foliar spraying any IPM stuff. So those are things that I like to use, and I do those frequently. But the botrytis, the bud mold, that's a thing. Like typically, what happens is people start seeing PM when the temperature starts to get cool and the
Yeah.
humidity is a little bit higher,
That's what
right? And
happened to
so
me.
what I've always one, genetics can help, but two, the bacillus and trichoderma work really really well. I do that, and I'll spray those because like the stuff that I have is just pure spore, so it doesn't leave any type of residue. And if it's outdoor and it's raining and all that shit and it's causing that stuff, I'm not afraid to spray bacillus and trich later on in flower. You know what I mean? Because it's already getting rained on and there's already microbes on there and there's microbes in the rainwater there. You know what I mean? It's like, so I would rather protect those from the bad ones with something that's going to be beneficial.
And now, what
um
about like you had mentioned the worm is burrowing in and it's shitting, and then in its shit, is
Shit
that
out of luck,
where?
dude. You're shit out of luck. If that happens, you got to cut it out. I mean, it's too late. Look at you didn't. It's like the verb. What do they say? The verbiage. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yes, yeah,
Like if
sure.
you already have the problem, there's not much that you can do to remediate it. Cut it off, cut your losses. You know what I mean? Learn from your mistakes.
And really, uh, mechanical removal. I mean, there's a lot to be said about vigilance. You know what I mean? Be in
Yeah,
their presence. If
if you have the time to go out there and do that, then that's great. But again, there's all these different products you can use. Horticulture oils all through veg. You can do like things like Suff Oil X, or there's natural stuff like pepper ferments, or there's enzymes, or there's essential oil type sprays. There's all different types of things that can be used. But me personally, I'm all about those biologicals, and I've seen the best efficacy, the best use with things like BT, Bacillus thuringiensis for caterpillars. And you just gotta stay on it. It's gotta be one of those things that, like, if you're gonna feed your plant, because you want good healthy plants, you want to smoke good weed, then you should probably have a budget for IPM, integrated
Yeah,
pest
yeah,
management.
for
yeah,
sure. Yeah, before we move on to NutriPots real quick, JR, I just want to recap on this point. Because it's just, like I said, an issue that I lived, and then I noticed that a lot of people were running into it as well. I definitely ran into what you were talking about earlier, which was caterpillars. And then at some point, I wasn't having any caterpillars anymore, but I was still finding bud rot popping up on different plants, even after I'd taken out buds on other plants and things like that. So what you're talking about with the bacillus and the what was it? Bacillus and
Trichoderma.
trichoderma. Yeah,
Yeah.
so are you foliar spraying this? Are you applying it to the
Yeah.
roots? Both?
So the interesting thing about the trichoderma is that it's been seen to work both as an endophyte. So if you inoculate soil, it can work in conjunction with the plant roots, similar to the way that our mycorrhizal fungi works. It's also been seen to penetrate inside of and work on the plant's phyllosphere. So you can see efficacy adding it into the soil system, and then you'll actually see some other benefits from the nutrient cycling and some of the metabolites that it produces in soil. So it's like another multifunctional product again. So you will see the ability to outcompete pathogens but it's also going to cycle nutrients and do some other cool fun stuff like
Yeah,
floor production.
that's really
that's super
interesting.
cool. That's really
But the
cool.
caterpillars, the thing is, what you probably are seeing is the caterpillars will cause damage. And even if you remove the caterpillars, if you haven't fully removed all of the damaged area, later on in flowering, that stuff starts to die back, and that's what you'll see. That's where the molds will start up again because it'll die. It'll kind of maybe dry out a little bit, and then it'll
Right.
rehydrate. So I've seen that happen before too.
Yeah, it was really. I mean, like I was talking to Jr. before the show started. Every year growing outside, I get hit with something different, or and I just learn every year what to do differently next year. It just seems like outdoor growing is always teaching you something. But I know we're over time, so I really appreciate your time today, Brandon. But let's talk about NutriPots because it's something really cool that you've been working on, and
Yeah.
let's just let us know what it is and if it's available yet.
Yeah, so it's not available, but it's going to be available soon. I've been working on different formulations and strength, and I've been doing the testing to see how effective it is and kind of, what I should expect to see as far as results. I put together a Instagram that's just for the NutriGrow pot, but I also post here and there about it on my feed. Essentially, it is the world's first fully compostable fertilizer pot. So it's a complete fertilizer nutrition that it is going to be a replacement for single-use plastics and starter fertilizer. And the idea is you have a compostable cup and you have some like maybe cocoa or peat moss or a starter little light soil mix inside of there. And you can start whatever type of product you want, maybe a tomato, a weed plant, whatever it is, cucumbers. And instead of when you go into a nursery or Home Depot or a Walmart or anything like that to go buy a tomato plant or a pepper plant, maybe you see a company that says Bonnie or whatever on there, and you go and you take that home and you take that plastic off, you disturb that root zone right there, and then you go and plant that into your little garden bed, and then you go and put a little bit of Miracle Grow on there, however you might do it, fertilize it with your organic amendments, depending on your skill set in gardening, wherever you might be. That's kind of a typical thing. That's how I've always kind of gone about it. With this product, the idea is to take the cup, not have the plastic. Don't disturb the root. You can take that, plant it directly into the ground. As you water, what's going to happen is the nutrients are going to are going to diffuse into that media, feeding the plant. Now, the roots can actually penetrate and go through that cup, but right there at that root zone, at that root ball, is going to be continually releasing that carbon and that nutrition. And so, in really sandy soils like I have here, I'm growing pumpkins using that. And I have tests at Bokashi Earthworks office where we're growing beans and pumpkins in sand, and we have controls and some with the NutriGrow pot, and we're seeing great results. And
I
I wanted
saw
to figure
that.
out I wanted to figure out which formulations would work the best, and I have a formulation that was too hot, but it's really good for like gourds, pumpkins, things like that.
Well, the thing that struck me that I thought was interesting is in our society now, they're starting to make us be more mindful of the opportunities in space. And I just thought it would be pretty interesting to have a pre made pot that you could put in just about any medium in our solar system that has, like Mars or whatever, that's not on fire or frozen. But you know what I'm saying. But if it's semi-habitable, you could throw a NutriPod in there, give it the little geodome that it needs, and bingo bango, you're eating, eggplants at night. And so I thought it was a really interesting concept. And so I have a friend, Scotty, he has this product, and it's basically a release, and it's tailored to what the cannabis kind of needs throughout its life cycle versus maybe what a rose would. In this case, are you designing this NutriProt to be kind of a catch-all, or are you going to have it be kind of a specific thing?
It's more of a catch-all for starting seeds and for, to replace the starter fertilizer aspect. So you just put this directly in the ground and you don't have to keep adding fertilizer. You won't have to add fertilizer till later. So what it does is it can save labor costs that would be associated with any of that, if you were doing this at scale, right? And then it saves even the home gardener, home grower money too, because they're not fertilizing as often because that thing has nutrition that's being released right there at the root zone. So what I'm actually doing is I put together a pitch deck. I went out to Chicago recently. I talked to Dr. George and Alani about the future steps, and we want to build a factory for the humate to do the humate fertilizer and to produce the cups, coat them, dry them, package them, and everything. And so I put together a like a company overview and everything like that, and a pitch deck type deal. And I'm looking to raise $2 million to start that process. But in the meantime, I'm just going to be doing two versions of it. One is going to be a 6 count little tray that you can do for like
That's
six
cool.
stores. And
Yeah.
then one's going to be a square. It's about 3.5 by 3.5 by 4 square pot. And so those will be the two things that I make. I'm going to be making them manually until we get the whole thing rolling, but I'll have
That's
test
how we
results.
do it. That's how we do it. Shout out, brother. I appreciate that grind. Because that's
Yeah.
how in our culture and in our industry, that's how we innovate. And the things that you're kind of pushing in a forward direction, I think that's really awesome. I mean, if I could just germinate in a cube, throw that in a 10-gallon pot, rock it, man, that saves me a lot. And that's valuable to me. I think that's really cool. So as we're kind of winding up and we're talking about these future aspects, we always like to have a final question for our guests. And so, where do you see AI's application coming online for indoor and outdoor applications?
Well, I mean,
Specifically indoor.
I've seen some technologies, or I've heard of some technologies. Again, I'm not super savvy with the computers and all that, but they can identify issues in areas, hotspots and canopies. They can do all kind, like, it can be like an eye in the sky type of
Yeah, that's what I was
situation.
thinking. Yeah.
Detect insect damage and pests or spores in the air. I saw somebody sent me a thing where some scientists developed a thing where they could detect like spores in the air, and just like crazy stuff like that. So there's going to be applications for the technology because we have such sophisticated sensing equipment now. And so with that sophisticated sensing equipment, they'll be able to implement some type of programming into that where it can help people. But again, all that shit, like what's the value if versus how much you're going to cost, how much it's going to cost, and how much you're going to have to pay for the software, and how much you're going to pay for the subscription, and
Exactly.
all, like, what does it look like overall versus, like, you just having a solid integrated pest management program that works well.
Yeah. No, that's a interesting point that you just mentioned. You got to pay attention with a lot of these tech products or businesses because essentially they usually get you roped in on these contracts.
You can't hold him unless you can hold your soda.
We're hearing some like random audio. I'm hearing it on JR's end. Sorry. I was just gonna say, the subscription that you mentioned, I've seen people complaining about weed maps and things like that lately because weed maps started cranking up their subscription prices. So I was just gonna say, people gotta be careful with what they kind of sign up for in these different deals and things like that. But anyways, JR just dropped. It looks like he's got to run, and we're running out of time. But Brandon, shout out your websites and services and YouTube channel, anything like that. Let us know where people can find you.
Yep. So you can find me on Instagram at rust.brandon, all spelled out. Be careful. There's a lot of imposters out there. And then you can find my company, Bokashi Earthworks, on Instagram, and Bokashi, Bokashi Earthworks, all one word, .net or .com. It doesn't matter. It'll lead you to the same place. And we've got the microbes on there. We've got humate fertilizers. We've got amendments. We've got seeds. So we have autoflowers, photos. We have all my breeding projects are listed on there. And then soon We're going to have international shipping to UK, Canada, Australia set up. So,
Well,
we'll
we
be able
would
to get-
love to have you. Sorry, I dipped out there for a second, guys. We would love to have you come back on and talk about all that, because that's an amazing process in itself. And to be able to finally get out and get our borders open and be able to spread the love of the plant, I think is going to be a powerful thing that's coming right down the road. So I'd love to have you back on, Brandon. And thank you so much for your time.
Thanks again, guys. I'll talk to you all soon.
All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for watching. Make sure to follow Brandon, check out his stuff. And as always, JR, growers love.
Growers love.
Girls love everybody.
Peace, man.